Hi, my name is Kirsten Grants, and this is my digital project proposal for medieval literature in 2026. All right, so about me, more information. So, I said before, I'm Kirsten Grants. I attend Kent State University, and I am an integrated language arts education major, just a fancy way of saying 7th through 12th grade integrated, English, all that jazz. So, I'm in my third year of schooling. I'm about to finish that out. I love to read and write, especially when I have creative freedom. And I guess my dream kind of part of this profession is I really just want to teach adolescents. I would love to teach high school age. I don't think I would want to go any further personally in that. I don't think I'd want to be a professor, but the possibilities are endless, and I'm going to start somewhere. So all right, so let me just give you a brief overview about what the project is. So, I create the concept of an escape room using riddles and charms. So, the focus of this presentation is about the Exeter riddles 68 and 69, the Frank's casket, and an educational approach. So, let's talk about just riddle number 68 on its own, right? The modern English translation: I saw that creature traveling on its way. She was wondrously, marvelously adorned. Okay, so after I did some more research kind of on this, I did a lot of research. I really was trying to figure this out because when I first approached this riddle, I saw that creature traveling on its way. She was wondrously, marvelously adorned. I thought of it has to be a living thing. That's really what I thought. I said, okay, a living thing, it's traveling, it's walking, or it's swimming, it's doing something, right? But it's something that is marvelous and it's and wondrously and marvelously adorned. When I think of marvelous, I think of beautiful, but I also kind of think of like it has to be something big, right? Something grand. So that's kind of, and I'll talk about deception in a moment, but that's like a very big moment of deception. Commonly accepted answer that I kind of doing my research and kind of figured out was in just this riddle alone, if you just pull out 68, I kind of figured out that it's a ship. I saw the creature traveling on its way. So it had to be, instead of a living thing, once I kind of got past that, and I said, what if it's not a living thing? What if it's just something that can travel? Once I got past that, that's how I kind of made the realization that maybe it could be a train, a bus, a car, like something modern day. I was thinking, and then I said, you know what? If I'm thinking about ice and water and things like that, ship is probably a good answer, especially when you combine the two. So that's kind of how I got there. So the answer, so I have a quote from Leah Olson, and Leah Olson says the best solution seems to be ship. So there's definitely a thematic connection between water, ice, and sea travel, which is, like I said, the conclusion that I came to, right? So, wondrously adorned. That's kind of like wondrously adorned. I kind of got to like sparkling ice, frozen. That'll make more sense when I get to 69. Uh, Personification and gendering, right? So that refers to feminine. It's not very straightforward. It's meant to, that's part of that deception part, right? So I was talking about deception earlier about a creature. And it being feminine doesn't really strike you as being like powerful and something like a ship that has that, like, that a lot of that power towards it, right? It invites multiple solutions, right? So bird, woman, ship with the banners, sea creature, or ice, right? So there's a lot of different directions you could go with this, and that's what makes it such a unique riddle, right? Like you could start to think about a bird, you could think about a woman because it's feminine, you could think about the ship, sea creatures, all of that, right? It emphasizes visuals and motion while keeping identity unknown and secretive. So basically, like I said, you really have to think kind of outside the box on this one because if, like, in my brain, I said this is definitely something that's got to be living. However, it's the visuals, right? The creature traveling, it's wondrously, marvelously adorned. It's telling me that this thing that's moving has a big significance. It's seen as wondrous and marvelous and grand and great, right? And so that kind of took me away from a bird, and I also kind of it took me away from a woman too, and just because of the time and modern translations and things. So that's kind of how I got to that conclusion of the ship after doing a lot of thinking, after doing a lot of research, and after these quotes, especially Leah Olson. It kind of got me to that point. So now I kind of move on. This is where I move on to 69, right? 69 on its own, A wonder happened on the wave. Water became bone. So, after, like I said, doing kind of my initial thought process, I wasn't sure. This one to me, though, was more straightforward than the first one, than riddle number 68. So the commonly accepted answer is ice here. Water became bone. When you think of bone, you think of bone being, our bones are hard. It is a hard structure, right? So water, practically, they could be saying water became ice, but they're not obviously going to say that. It's a riddle, right? So this liquid is turning into rigid matter. So, here, so I have a quote from Patrick Murphy. So here the riddle asks how water can become bone. It doesn't say ice is bony, but it demands that we make a logical leap from water, turn to bone to ice. So that's a really cool example of riddling, right? It's meant to, this one's not meant to, I don't think, be as tricky, but it is meant to kind of get your brain thinking, like, water became bone. Like, how does that happen? What are you talking about? If you don't do your research on it, it is kind of a more difficult concept, right? So, we have that parallel clause providing the clue. It narrows their focus. The puzzling becomes more clear when you think about it in the way that, I kind of brought to the attention, right? So there's also this example of a natural transformation, which was seen a lot in medieval literature, right? So a frost and ice tides, they were often described as wondrous back in medieval literature, which in a second, we put the two together and you'll see. But a wonder happened and water became bone, right? Something marvelous and grand happened, and all of a sudden the water became ice. So I have one more quote to share. I really thought this was interesting from Craig Williamson. And look at all that alliteration he said, because there are lots of W's. We have no fewer than 5 W words in the one line here. There's only one word in the line that starts with a different letter, and the sounds of these letters almost resemble the wobbly flowiness of water, solidifying into a sharp bursting B, right? Became bone. So I think that was actually really cool, and I hadn't thought about it until I was doing more research. That does kind of make sense, right? You have the kind of the wobbliness of that W and of that alliteration there, and that is what is unique about this. That's another aspect that's really unique about this riddle that I really enjoyed. That water being in that kind of up and down way, right? So, riddle number 69 on its own, like I said, I think is definitely more straightforward. And based on kind of the more research I was doing, I definitely agree that this is pretty cool. So, now I'm just gonna talk about a little bit about here's what happens when you combine them, right? So I'm going to read the whole poem, right? Or the whole poem, so sorry. The whole riddle. I saw that creature traveling on its way. She was wondrously, marvelously adorned. A wonder happened on the way. Water became bone. So why they might be combined, right? So it strengthens the solution. It gives some beginning to end context, right? You have a start of the story. I saw this creature traveling on the way. That's the beginning of the story, right? And then you have the ending about saying that the wonder happened and water became bone. So it is a start to finish kind of, a start to finish put together riddle, which is why a lot of scholars believe that these two actually should be combined into one. And that whole solution is, what you're going to get is ice, is kind of at the end, right? So you kind of got that, right? So it reads more narratively and explanatory. It turns the wonder shown into a witnessed process, right? So, like I just said, it's a whole story, it's a process, it shows the process. So, ice, as we can find out through those clues, right? So the transformation is an event rather than like a mysterious miracle, right? It makes more sense. So it's more story like it shows an evolution. When you have one separated from the other, you can find a solution, but when you combine the two, it shows the whole story. And I think that actually makes the riddle more interesting and more it's just more of a joy to read and, a joy to work through. So I really think that that is pretty awesome, and I like them when they're combined better than when they're separated, just because I think that you can dig deeper and really truly put them together and find meaning in that. Okay, so let's talk about the Frank's casket. Because kind of how I'm pulling this in, right, is, you have, the flood cast up the fish on the mountain cliff. The Terror King became sad where he swam on the shingle whale's bone. So here's the significance of the casket, right? So the casket is carved from whale's bone or whale ivory, right? Which this kind of relates because we're talking about, in our riddles, we found the answer to be ice or, ice. And before we're talking about whale bone, right? Bone turned to ice and ivory, right? So the riddle is written in Old English, using Anglo Saxon runes. So the inscriptions are really short on this box, right? They're punning or riddle like, and you have to work through them. So it mixes Roman, Jewish, Christian, and Germanic subjects. So I found also, though, in a quote also by Patrick Murphy when I was doing my research, said despite the strong Germanic imagery and style of the casket, the actual design and layout is based on a casket from northern Italy. Possibly a similar casket traveled back with Benedict Biscop after one of his many visits to Rome. So there's a lot of speculation and belief that this casket actually came from Italy, which is interesting because you don't have that Roman, well, you do have that Roman, but Italy being in Rome, it makes sense, right? So I thought that that was really cool thing to share. I also really like how, uh, you're talking about along the border of the front panel. It's a riddle about the casket itself, and that's what is up there, right? It's written in the Old English runes and ends with the solution, the flood, which I had read, right? So when you actually look at the front panel, it literally tells you what the solution is, which is interesting because a lot of, riddles are meant to be solved. But what if we're reading too much between the lines? What if it is as literal as it might seem? Which I kind of think relates back to 69, right? We're talking about 69 and how the answer's right in front of you. It says that the water's turned to, to bone. It tells you it's turned to bone, and it's not bone, but it's something that's solid. It's water, forming different solids. So I think that's really cool. But however, some of these panels, so the right one and the lid, which is, they are disputed by scholars. Some scholars say that those panels don't actually really help you solve the riddle, that they're just kind of wrong in certain ways. And that's kind of something that I did some research on, and there are multiple different scholars that have multiple different answers to those panels. So this is kind of a continuation, right, of that. Just talking about the significance of the casket and the panels real quick, right? The front panel is Old English caption runes. It's, Wayland smithing. That front panel, the right part is Christian caption linking, the image to the Magi. Romulus and Remus and referencing, Rome's creation, right? The back panel, you have the captions referencing conquest or judgment. The right panel, you have the punning runes and Old English lines, and the lid is a decorative border, which is meant to be there, but it's also meant to be significant to that whale's bone, right? So I really like the Frank's casket. I think it's pretty cool. So putting them together, right, the riddle's metaphor and the object's substance illuminate one another, right? They highlight the medieval strategies of decoding, and we study them together. It shows how the Anglo-Saxon people imagined materials, right? It shows that whale's bone, and it shows how the use of the casket is a riddle itself, which is awesome, by the way. The metaphor and narrative showed knowledge about production, right, trade, and nature and riddles, and they showed the early medieval culture that tolerated. It played with multiple sources and classical images and ambiguity, right? It really tried to be different and interesting. So, kind of relating to what I would be doing if I was to put this in a lesson, students can trace how metaphor becomes an object. So here's just a really, really quick rundown of the escape room. This is a brief synopsis. You can pause to read, but I would do, I'd give them images of the panels. They'll be given captions. That's the first one. They would be working with runes, so they're giving the inscriptions with the alphabet shapes. They'll get a code word related to ice, something that has to do with the riddle, right? Then they'll have the Old English lines from the riddles and their translations because, you know, if I'm teaching this to, like, hypothetically, I would teach this to high school. You know, I would give them both the translate just so that they could help, depict them, right? But they'll choose the best possible answer. They'll provide evidence. There will be a hidden number on the card that's correct. So they'll be given a list of possible solutions to these riddles, right? So they can identify, then they would identify which sample best matches the casket material. So they'll be given those. They'll given the sample tags. So it's a whole thing. They get to this small panels illustrating the journey, right? So they have to figure out the order. They'll put them in a narrative sequence, and like there will be a number code on the back, right? So you get that. That'll get them the final lock. And then the final lock, if they successfully open it, they will provide the answers. So they will get this page and it congratulates them, and that's how they get the points. So basically, the escape room is a whole big thing. It's connecting the ideas of you kind of start small. You kind of smart. You're starting really small, and then you're building up to I have to figure out the answers, and then oh, I have to figure out not only Frank's casket, but I also have to figure out what material was it made out of, and it's all of these concepts that I just talked about kind of wrapped into one. So it's pretty cool. So like I said, I think the students would find a lot of joy in doing something like this. If I were to ever actually plan this out and do this whole thing for my classroom, I definitely think that it would be more hands on rather than on the computer. Just think there's more value in them actually having to use their hands and work with it and manipulate. But yeah, so these are my sources, and thank you very much for listening to my presentation today. I hope you learned something, and I really hope that you enjoyed talking about these riddles with me. All right.